Hello YouTube folks, welcome to my channel. My name is Steph and today I am doing a full plot summary of the Eve trilogy by Anna Carey. If you've seen my videos before, you'll notice that my hair is much shorter and is now curling, even though I've had straight hair my whole life. Couldn't tell you, but today I'm going to be doing a full plot summary like promised. So this trilogy I've had on my shelves for literally a decade at this point. I read this series when I was probably in middle school and I loved it. I thought it was the pinnacle of literature. This trilogy is really just something that came to life after the immense popularity that The Hunger Games experienced in 2008. The Eve trilogy by Anna Carey, the first book was published in 2011, so pretty clearly some sort of causation correlation situation there. But this series is basically a Handmaid's Tale retelling. It's not terribly original. The writing is fine. Like, I loved it when I was a kid, like I said. So if you're really into young audience swallowable stories, I think you'll enjoy it. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say it's bad, but is it the best dystopian YA romance trilogy I've ever read? No, I'm afraid that Hunger Games still holds that position. I'm afraid that they are still the winners there. Of course, no hate to the author, no hate to the series. I'm just here to have a good laugh and tell a little tale about Eve and her journey in New America. I just readjusted you down a little bit so you could see me better. Trigger warnings. Again, this is a Handmaid's Tale retelling. First book literally opens with a quote from The Handmaid's Tale. So trigger warnings are pretty obvious. Sexism, sex, sexual violence, talks of rape and gender-related violence, kidnapping, guns, general violence and dead bodies, hanging. You know, it's dystopian. Like, it's gonna have that governmental drama. Without further ado, Eve, I have notes here, so I'm going to be looking down a lot, just so you know. We open with Handmaid's Tale, like I said, a little excerpt from that. And then there's a prologue that is a letter, assumably to Eve, right, the main character, and it's from Mom. And it ends with, I love you, I love you, I love you. Keep that locked in. We open at a school. It's literally just called The School, capital S, School. There's Eve, our main character, and then her two besties, Pip and Ruby. And they're dancing. It's the night before their graduation. They're having a good time when somebody in their class who's also graduating, Arden, is like, she's like the class troublemaker. And Eve sees her like on the outskirts of the party causing trouble. And she's like, I'm going to go follow her. She follows Arden. And Arden's like putting soldiers' clothes on. She's like, what are you doing? And Arden turns to Eve and she's like, this school is not what it says. We're not going to like the graduate school. They call it the graduate school where you master a trade before going to the city of sand, which is where the king lives, in the city of sand. None of it's true. When we turn 18, we graduate tomorrow. We're getting sent to the graduate school to be repeatedly forcefully impregnated and sedated to repopulate the city. And Arden jumps on like a soldier jeep. Every car in this trilogy is a jeep. Anytime you see jeep, you know it's the government coming for you. But Arden dips and Eve's like, what the heck? So that night she does something she's never done before because she's little Miss Goody Two Shoes. She like won medal of achievement. She's valedictorian of her class, right? She's like perfect in every way. She does something bad for the first time that night. She escapes her little dorm she shares with Ruby and Pip, and she crosses the lake. None of these people in this school know how to swim, and she like uses the branches like monkey bars to cross the lake. That's kind of how I imagine it in my head. And she gets to the graduate school. She looks in the windows and she sees the valedictorian and other classmates from the graduating year prior pregnant and like strapped to beds and like drooling and stuff. She panics. She somehow crosses a lake again. No problems there. And she gets back to school, and one of the teachers, her name's Teacher Florence, helps her escape. She like gives her a bag and tells her how to get to this safe haven for girls called Califia. Keep that girl locked in too. Eve really wants to bring Pip and Ruby, but the teacher's like, no, you can't risk it. If you want to escape, it needs to just be you. So Eve escapes by herself. She's like traversing through the woods. This is like, it takes place in like California, Nevada, like Western America. So it's like deserts galore. So this girly pop is sweating. She's having a hard time. And she like smells food cooking or something, and she peeks in a window in a house, and who does she see? Arden, the bad girl from school, capital S school. And Eve begs Arden if they can traverse to Califia together, and Arden ruefully says yes. Oh my god, okay, this is one I can't even look at you. I can't even look at the camera. Even Arden split off for a little bit to go look for food and resources and stuff. And Eve sees a baby bear and she's like, oh my god, it's so sweet and cute like Winnie the Pooh. And then Mama Bear appears and chases her. Mama Bear appears and chases her, and Eve is like running away when a man on a horse appears. Now, something I haven't shared yet, but all the girls in capital S school were told and took classes on how men are evil and marriage is bad and like everything is horrible when it has to do with relations between men and women should stick to themselves. So she sees this man and she's terrified. She's been trained that he's basically like this horrible monster, but he saves her life. And Arden finds them later, and she also is like creeped out by the guy. He says his name is Caleb. He's described as a white dude with long brown dreadlocks, which is such a meme. So 2011 core. But the girls are starving, and he's like, you should come back with me to my dugout. We have food. We'll feed you. And the girls are like, I don't know. And then they go. First man they meet, and they're like, you know what? We'll hop on this man's horse, and we'll go with him to, assumably, his man cave. Makes sense. On the way to the dugout, Arden gets really sick. There's a scene that isn't important, so I kind of didn't go over it, but they're like running away from government people who are trying to find them, and they have to swim through a lake in the rain. And so assumably Arden gets like pneumonia, like that's kind of what it's giving. She's got a fever and a cough, and she's struggling to keep food down, etc. She gets really sick, so Caleb and Eve get her to the dugout. Caleb admits that he's seen Eve before in a pamphlet or like a wanted sign that's like, girl escaped from school, like you like reward for finding her, she must be found alive. And Eve theorizes that the king wants her to give him heirs. She thinks like, he was rumored to come to our graduation. What if he was like scoping me out because he wants to use me as his personal like breeding lady? She's like highly valuable. Caleb like knew her before she met him, but I guess we'll let it slide. They get to the dugout, and it's exactly as you imagine. It's basically Lord of the Flies, and it's just like all these men and boys shirtless and gnawing on bones, and Eve is like, what have I done? But she kind of has no choice at this point, right? Arden's sick, and Eve's a good Miss Heroine girl. Like, she wants to keep her friend alive, and she's starting to think Caleb's cute. First man she's ever met in her entire life, and she's like, Zam. It's redonkulous, I know, but what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? It's 2011, and it's YA dystopian romance. What are we gonna do? The leader of the dugout, his name is Leaf, is kind of like especially mean to Eve and Arden. Arden gets put in a bed and she gets taken care of by like the local medic or whatever. And then these two little boys, probably like 5, 6, 7 years old, their names are Benny and Silas, see Eve, and assumably it's the first woman they've ever seen because the girls and the boys are being kept separate in the wild. But they're like, are you my mother? And Eve's like, no. And then somehow they end up being taught how to read by Eve. So she's like teaching them how to read and reading them stories. And one of the stories she reads talks about love. And one of the little boys is like, what's love? And the older boys are like, when you really want to kiss a girl. And Eve's like, no, it's when your life is better with somebody else and you can't imagine life without them. And the little boys are like, I love my mother. It's kind of a sweet moment, a little bit, tiny bit of cred. Eve goes to find Caleb, and he's like in his room dozing, and she sees a bunch of books on his floor, and she's like, I didn't know you could read. I assumed nobody could read here because the boys couldn't. And Caleb was like, yeah, I can read. I like kind of taught myself. And then he goes on to talk about how the boys, like I said, the boys and the girls were separate. The girls were in the capital as schools. And the boys have been in labor camps, essentially, like slaves. They're like making bricks and getting whipped and stuff. And they all have like a mark burnt into their arm to mark them or whatever. So they kind of have a moment. He like lends her a book that she thinks is sexist, but he's like, it's not, you should reread it. Which, I don't know about you, but me personally, if a man comes up to me and is like, you think this book is sexist, reread it and get back to me, I would be like, actually, shut up. There's like a moment where Caleb teaches her how to swim, and like there's like an initiation ceremony for the boys who are old enough to hunt now, and like Eve and Caleb are like falling in love, and Arden's slowly getting better, whatever, like who cares. They then find out that there's like an abandoned like soldier troop location, like they have like their encampment with all their resources, but the jeeps are gone. So Arden's all better now, and Eve is like, I think I want to stay, Caleb, and Caleb's like, you should, but you're dangerous because you're wanted, so like be careful. And Arden, Eve, Caleb, Leaf, Benny, Silas, all of them go to the soldier encampment to like have a little party and steal all their stuff. Arden uses her bobby pin to pick the lock on the door, and they get in, they like have a party. There's like a piano, there's tons of food and chocolate, like people are dancing. Caleb and Eve dance, and everyone's like, ooh, ah, and it's really sweet. And then they get like in a tiff, so they split off. Eve is like sleeping, I imagine it in like the attic of this building, because she's like surrounded by storage bins. I don't know, I guess she wanted to be alone because she was like so upset with Caleb. But she's sleeping there, and she sees in the dark somebody like stumbling up to her and tripping over the box. She's like, Caleb, is that you? And the person just starts kissing her. And she notices it doesn't feel right, and she like, her eyes start to focus in the dark, and she realizes it's Leaf. And he starts to try to assault her. He's like pinning her down, forcefully kissing her face and her neck, and she's like screaming. And everybody rushes up into what I assume is the attic, including Caleb. Caleb and Leaf fight. He's like, don't touch my girl that I've known for like 2 weeks. Whatever. And Leaf turns to Eve and is like, you wanted it though, didn't you? And Eve's like, I don't know. That's what she says in her like shock. She's like in shock or whatever. She was just molested. And Caleb gets so mad, she says, I don't know. And he storms out after beating the crap out of Leaf until he's unconscious. Caleb disappears into the night, and we're back at the dugout. We've left the party, and everyone hears like rumbling, because the dugout's like a big hole in the side of the mountain. So like when you hear trucks, the dirt reverberates and stuff. And then everyone goes outside, and they see a truck with a sleazy guy in it. His name is Fletcher. And Leaf and him like exchange money or something, and Fletcher takes Eve captive. He like kidnaps her. He takes her because Leaf like sold her out. And he grabs Arden too, and he dips. And it's really sweet. Actually, this moment, Benny and Silas, the two little boys, are like screaming and following the truck, and they're like, I love you, because Eve like taught them what I love means and whatever. And obviously everybody in the dugout's super mad with Leaf, because nobody wanted the girls to leave, but Leaf was mad at Eve for like rejecting him. Because everybody wants her, because she can read. Yes. Eve and Arden escape Fletcher, the kidnapping freaky man, by saying they have to go to the bathroom at the same time. There's also a third girl there. Her name is Lark. She's like 15. He also kidnapped her, and I don't know, he's gonna sell her or something. But they escape by pretending to all have to pee at the same time, and they run in different directions. Obviously, Fletcher pursues Eve because she's the most valuable, right? She's wanted by the king. And he has a gun, and Eve hears a gunshot, assumes that he shot at her, turns around, but he's on the ground, and she sees this old lady named Marjorie. Marjorie and her man's Otis are these two old people, oh my god, get this, who are on the trail. Capital T, the capital T trail. The trail is they literally recite the Underground Railroad. Marjorie and Otis recite it, and they're like, it's inspired by Harriet Tubman. We got people to California's safety away from the labor camps and the schools. And Eve's like, who's Harriet Tubman? It's actually so funny. But they like house them, and then Eve is super distressed over the Caleb situation, and she recalls a conversation with him about this man who created the trail called Moss, who is working in the city of Sand right now. He's like undercover, trying to like start a revolution. Keep that locked in, y'all. Keep that locked in. And he communicated by radio back in the day. So Eve has the brilliant idea to steal Marjorie and Otis's radio and get a message out to Caleb. But obviously, the whole freaking world heard the radio message. So soldiers show up at Marjorie and Otis's house. They kill Marjorie and Otis. They kill that third girl, Lark, who was irrelevant. Eve and Arden split up, and they run away, whatever. Eve is like so depressed. She's like sitting in an abandoned house in a bathtub, like, in the arms of the angels. Like ridiculous, like being so drama. And she's like, I betrayed Pip and Ruby, my OG girls, because I didn't take them, and Arden might be dead, and Caleb's gone, and Lark and Marjorie and Otis are dead. Like, ah. But she gets her butt up, and she continues on her way to Clefia. She hears like a truck starting to approach her, and she sees that it's Caleb. He did hear her radio message, and he somehow magically found her pretty far away, assumably from Marjorie and Otis's house. He found her, and they're on their way to Clefia. They get stopped at like this big wall where soldiers are. They're like, identification. And Caleb lies, and he's like, this means the store, and our stuff was burnt, our house was stolen, and everything was burnt down. We need to get through here. And then one of the soldiers recognizes Eve. He's like, it's her! And everyone's like freaking out. And somehow Eve gets a gun. She kills like all the soldiers except for one. Caleb gets shot in the leg by another soldier, and she gets the only soldier that survived to drive Caleb's car at gunpoint with Caleb in the back bleeding out. Obviously, Caleb's having a hard time. He's bleeding a lot out of his leg. And the soldier's like, if you free me, I'll sew him up. And Caleb's like, absolutely don't, because he's going to go get his cohorts and come back for you. And Eve's like, absolutely yes, I can't let you die. Soldier sews Caleb up, disappears, and they make it to Clefia. Men are not allowed in Clefia. So Caleb knew this the whole time, and Eve didn't, and she's like not mad at him for not sharing this information, especially because he's like bleeding out and going to die. Eve's like, please come in, and all the women at like the border wall or whatever, like, he can't come, and he like leaves with like gun wound in his leg, and her last thought is, I love you, I love you, I love you, like the prologue letter ended from her mom. And she goes to Clefia, and that is how book 1 ends. Book 2, Once. These names are mad creative. Eve, Once, and then Rise. I bet you can imagine what the third book is gonna be about. Book 2 is kind of like, I don't want to say it's like a filler book, but there's a lot of things that happen just to like transition to this new level in the story, in this world. Eve's in Clefia. She's got a BFF, Quinn. Quinn's mom, Maeve, is like one of, they call them like founding mothers of Clefia. Arden shows up dressed as a man and like isn't allowed in, but Eve recognizes her, and she has like a big dog, like a Rottweiler or something, and Arden's like, I finally made it to you, and they're like, yes. Eve and Arden are sleeping in Maeve's house. That's where Eve's been staying. And she overhears a conversation between Maeve, Quinn, her bestie, her new bestie anyway, Clethia, and a third woman. Her name's Isis. She's like another founding mother, arguing about whether or not to let Eve stay because Eve is highly wanted. Quinn, of course, is like, we need to let her stay. We're all fugitives here. Like, she belongs here with us. Isis, the third woman, is the opposite. She's like, we need to get Eve out of here. She's putting us in danger, putting us at higher risk of being found. And Maeve is like, I'm between you two. Let's let her stay. But if it would be advantageous to us to trade her or give her up or something, we will take advantage of that. Eve is obviously very distressed about this. And Eve and Arden start planning an escape when they hear somebody else in Clethia talking about... This doesn't make sense to me, but just roll with it. These two girls at, like, the dinner hall are talking about how a stray, which is, like, one of the people who isn't part of any sort of organization, but they live outside of the city of Sand, like a ruffian, you know? A stray that one of them had traded with talked about boots that he got off of a man with an infected leg wound living in an IKEA. And immediately Eve is like, that's Caleb, babe. Infected leg wound, that's Caleb. So Eve and Arden go to find Caleb because Eve's scared he's like gonna die. And it's not Caleb. It's actually the soldier, if you remember from book 1, who drove the car and stitched Caleb up. His name is Stark. He's actually an important character now in book 2. He set it up because he was hoping that Eve would leave Clethia, leave her hiding spot to find Caleb. And Stark grabs Arden and Eve and he zips away. They get kidnapped once again. On their way to the city of Sand to deliver Eve to the king, per the king's request, per the wanted sign, they stop at the school, capital S school, to drop Arden off because she's a runaway from the school and she needs to go be impregnated. Obviously, Arden is super upset with this because she escaped to escape this fate. And while she's there, Eve actually sees Ruby and Pip, and they're both like, not visually pregnant, but they're sedated. One of them's like banging their head on the fence and the other one's drawing circles on the like picnic table or whatever. Like, they're clearly messed up in the head. And Eve's like, damn, I really ruined so many people's lives, didn't I? She ends up at the city of Sand. I kind of imagine it like a literal giant mud wall circle surrounding everything. And they get into it. It's actually Las Vegas, I think. Like, it takes place in Las Vegas. So, like, the palace where the king lives is this huge casino hotel place, which I thought was kind of interesting. That's kind of unique. But Eve gets brought to the king, and the king, she's like, I'll never give you heirs. And the king's like, you're not going to give me heirs. You're my daughter. Tell me how that happens. Tell me... You know what? I'll tell you how it happened. He was perusing the pictures of what was going to be the graduating class of that capital S school that she was attending. And he saw a picture of Eve and was like, she looks just like my lover from right before the plague. I don't know about you, but if I had never met my dad my whole life, and I saw him, who I look very much alike, you know, we're both Sicilian, we're both very similar looking, I look nothing like my mother. If I saw his picture in a book, online, whatever, I would not look at that man and be like, that's my dad. Like, even her biological mother must be freaking twins. Tell me how that works. But yeah, so now we learn about the plague. We actually learned about it in the first book, but it wasn't relevant enough. But there was a plague that was killing a bunch of people, a virus, whatever. And then they created a vaccine, and the vaccine made people even more sick and made the virus even stronger, killed even more people. Eve lost her mother to the virus when she's like 6 or whatever. And the king goes on to tell how he became the king. He was like the governor of Sacramento, and when internet and electricity went down and communications became unavailable, and a ton of people like in the actual federal government were dying, he was the only one who was getting communications out to people and coming up with solutions and stuff. And so people just elected him to be king. So now he's in control of Western America. She's obviously freaking out over all this information. She's like, "You're my dad?" It's Luke Skywalker 101 right there. But she meets Beatrice, who is her little maid person. And Beatrice brings Eve to her fancy room where she doesn't know the code to. And that's kind of how we meet the City of Sand. There's then a big celebration talking about how the princess, her full name is Genevieve. So 2011, oh, we're in 2012 at this point. Sorry. Once came out in 2012. There's a big celebration. There's a car processional, whatever, for Eve to be introduced to the city. She gets to a stand or whatever where the king gives a speech, and she sees in the crowd Caleb, who had shaved his dreadlocks off. That was important enough to mention. In 2012, I guess, he shaved his dreads. And she asks the king if she can go meet the people. And obviously she just wants to see Caleb, and she sees him. He shakes her hand and slips a paper into her hand. And she's like, yes. She gets back to her room. She reads the paper, and it's directions on how and when to meet him in the city. The after party for this celebration of finally meeting the princess, we meet a lot of characters, so keep your listening ears open. We meet Charles, who is the head of development. He took on that role after his father had recently passed, which is basically he builds all the buildings, which also basically means that he's the reason why those kids are still working in the labor camps, because they're making the bricks and stuff that he's stacking to build buildings in the City of Sand. We also meet Clara and Rose. Rose is the king's sister. Also, we never learn the king's name. He is referred to as the king this whole book. It's giving the school. It's giving the labor camps. Make it make sense. Anyway, we meet Clara and Rose. Rose is the king's sister, and Clara is Rose's daughter, and therefore Clara and Eve are cousins. And Clara has a huge crush on Charles. Charles is immediately interested in Eve because, of course, she's the beautiful main character. I just kicked my camera. I'm so sorry. Everybody has to love her. And the king is also very wanting Eve and Charles to happen. Anyway, the party ends. Eve goes to her room and she follows the directions that Caleb gave her. And on her way out, Clara spots her and is like, "Eve, is that you?" And Eve turns her head. What a dumb girl. Let me tell you what. She turns her head and keeps running. And Clara's like, "Eve, I saw you." And Clara knows that Eve shouldn't be leaving her room. She somehow escaped. Eve gets out of the casino. They call it the Palace, capital T, capital P, Palace. And she makes it to this speakeasy from the directions that Caleb gave her, and they embrace. And they catch each other up on what's going on. Caleb was enlisted by Moss to work in the city. Somehow he survived his leg wound and was able to make it there. And so he's part of the inner rebellion. And Eve's like, "Zam, cool." And obviously the speakeasy closes, so they have to say their goodbyes. He gives her more directions on how and where and when to meet him. And she goes back to the palace. You'll notice in these next two books, it's lots of back and forth to and from the same locations, with just a little bit of progression in the plot. We couldn't just stay in one spot and have multiple things happen. It has to be a whole day passed and just a little bit more was given from each location and scenario. But you know what? Gotta fill that page quota, right? The next morning, it's breakfast. Clara, Rose, Charles, the king, and Eve are eating. Who knows why Charles is there when it clearly seems like a family breakfast, but work. And Clara accuses Eve of escaping. Eve denies it, and the king is getting sus of Eve. And then Charles is like, "Let me show you this fountain I helped build." And she's like, "Okay." And he's obviously continuing to have feelings for her. And Eve's continuing to not be interested in him because she's only got eyes for Caleb. Later that same day, Clara gives Eve a tour of the museum. They have like a museum of assumably stolen artifacts. But Clara says that the king was married and had 3 kids. And that Eve's mom was the king's mistress. Like, he had a love affair. And Eve's like, no, you're wrong. They loved each other. And Clara's like, I had 3 cousins already, and they all died from the plague. That's the only reason why you're the princess. Eve goes to the king, hysterical, and she's like, is this true? And the king's like, yeah, I mean, we were like going through a divorce, but it hadn't been processed yet. Your mom was curating for a museum. She was an artist. This is when Eve learns that her mom was an artist. We also never get a name for her mom. She's just your mom, or the mom, or my mom. Sick. He's like, I was working for a fundraiser at a museum that your mom was curating at, and we had an affair, and then when the plague happened, things got so out of hand, and we had no way to communicate. It wasn't until your mom had died and you were gone from the house that I even got the communications from her and knew that you existed. Work. And Eve's like, what's going on? So that night, she gets out of the palace again, doesn't get spotted this time, and she makes it to Caleb, who, like, gives her a gondola ride. And while they're, like, under the bridge, he kisses her and touches under her shirt. And she, like, has a flashback to school and all the time she was told that men want to touch your body and take advantage of you. She pushes those thoughts away and she's like, I want you to touch me. Work. It's not like you were told to fear men for 12 years and the first man to touch you under your shirt, you're like, yes. Like, I feel like that trauma, that teaching, I would be like, you know, I don't know, like, it just doesn't compute with me, but you know what, to each his own. He then afterwards takes her to meet his other cohorts working for Moss. I forgot their names. I thought I wrote it down, but I didn't. There are 2, it's a man and a woman, they're important. Just know there's 2 other people working with Caleb. Obviously, the 2 people working for Moss are really sus of Eve because she's literally the princess. She's literally related to the king, the person they're trying to, like, overthrow and end the regime of. So she, like, gets in a fight with them and then leaves. And Caleb is like, it's all good, it's all good. But she's like, how can I help? How can I prove myself? And then she gets an idea. The next day, she sees Charles and is like, oh my god, will you, like, show me what you're working on? And he takes her into his office, and while he's going to find something, she finds folders in a drawer called emergencies. It's labeled that way. And one of the forms she happened to grab was Las Vegas drainage system. The people of the revolution are trying to build tunnels under the big wall. 2 of them are struggling, and the 3rd one had a big collapse, and they're struggling to get around, like, pipage and sewage to navigate these tunnels. So that night, when she sees Caleb again, she has these forms. She, like, proves herself to the 2 other rebellions. They are also meeting in, like, a hangar, like, with a bunch of airplanes in it, and this is when Caleb and Eve go to an airplane, and they have sex. Which is, like, so fine, but neither of them have, like, any sex education. Neither of them probably really knew what they were doing. And I'm like, this is supposed to be for young adult readers. Are you really promoting that a man who was raised as a slave, basically, and a woman who was raised to hate family, hate marriage, hate men, engage in sexual intercourse with no, like, understanding of the implications there? I guess, you know what? I guess it's just giving 2012. We're in book 2 and it's giving 2012. Sadly, they fall asleep after canoodling, and one of the rebellion people, like, slams on the door, like, I knew you guys were up to no good at, like, it's 8:30 in the morning. And Eve's like, oh no, the king's gonna notice my absence. I need to get back. So Caleb's like, I'll come with you to, like, keep you safe. And Eve's like, no, you should stay. And he convinces her to let him follow her. So they walk to the palace. They're, like, 30 feet apart, so it's not, like, literally they're hand in hand. And he has soldier garb on. Obviously, she gets noticed and pulled into the palace. And he gets noticed because his, like, shirt's all wrinkly and buttoned wrong because he, like, threw it on fast. And he gets grabbed by other soldiers. And Eve's like, go, let him go. And obviously they don't let him go. Eve has an audience with the king. He's like, how did you escape? What are you doing with the rebel? I know he's a rebel. What are you doing? And Eve's like, don't kill him, don't kill him, don't do it. And he's like, somebody has to pay for those soldiers you killed back in book 1, remember? Back in book 1, Stark's buddies at that wall when Caleb got shot in the leg. The king is like, somebody has to pay for those deaths, and it's not gonna be you. And Eve turns to the king and says, I'll do whatever you want if you let Caleb live. I'll marry Charles. The king never said he wanted you to marry Charles. Where did you get this idea? Like, it's giving Anna Carey really wanted a love triangle to exist where you really hate one of the men, just like in the Hunger Games with Gale, right? We all hate Gale. But it would have only worked if the king was like, you should be together, yes. Like, obviously the king was happy they were, like, becoming cordial, but there was never any implications that the king was like, I would do anything to get you guys to get married. Yes. But in this moment, the king's like, fine, Caleb will live if you marry Charles ASAP. I'll send him outside the walls to disappear into the wilderness. And Eve's like, I want to see him one more time. And the king's like, fine. So Eve goes to see Caleb. He's all beaten up and he's like in the dungeons. And he's like, they told me they would let me go. What did you do? What did you say? And Eve's like, I told them I would marry Charles. And Caleb's like, but if you marry him, there'll be no more us. And Eve's like, but I can't let you die. Like, I feel like she's kind of being reasonable. Even though the whole marrying Charles, like, there probably was something else she could have done. But, like, work. And then Caleb turns to her and he's like, you know, you're not the only one in the newspaper. Like, he says some sort of something to imply something about the newspaper. And she's like, what? And then he gets dragged away. Eve returns to the palace and Claire is sad. Her cousin's sad because she has the hots for Charles. And Charles is like, we'll make it work. I kind of have feelings for you anyway because you're so worldly. You're so different. And you're not Clara, who everyone thought I was going to end up with. And Eve is like, I can't do this. She's like, she is so obsessed. She has to marry Charles because all she wants is Caleb, but she'd do anything to keep him alive. So what are you going to do? Eve is trying on wedding dresses and there's like a newspaper on the table or whatever where Clara and her mom Rose had just been eating breakfast. And Eve goes to the newspaper and tries to like find a code or whatever. Beatrice is like a little bit in on like Eve's situation too. Beatrice is kind of helping Eve like betray the king and stuff. Like not directly, but she's in the know. While Eve is doing this, Clara walks in because assumably she forgot something at breakfast. It's not made clear, but whatever, we'll let it go. And she sees Eve like drawing on the newspaper and she snatches the newspaper and runs away and locks herself in a room. And Eve's like, literally give that back. And Claire's like, now I have proof that you're, betraying the king and you don't actually love Charles. And Eve's like, I don't love Charles. And Claire opens the door and she's like, what do you mean? And Eve's like, I have to marry Charles. It's the only way I can free the man that I actually love, who is a rebel. And Claire's like, And Eve's like, and they kind of come up with the idea that maybe they both want the same thing, but for very different reasons. They both want Eve to leave. So Claire gets the paper back. Eve like shreds it. And now Claire is also in on code escape from the palace, along with Beatrice and Eve and obviously the other rebels. Eve asks the king if she can go to her old school, capital S school, because she's like, I ran away really fast and like people are probably thinking that like something's weird and they're like suspicious. So if I go and I like talk to them, they'll know nothing's wrong with me. I'm just the princess. And the king is like, fine. So she goes to the school. She sees Arden, Ruby, and Pip. She slips Arden a key that she somehow gets from the teacher that helped her escape, Teacher Florence, back in book 1, remember? And then she dips the school. And she's like, don't forget about Ruby and Pip. Make sure you take care of my friends. Kind of like giving a code of like, if you escape, take them with you. So somehow Eve finds out that the king lied and that Caleb's still in jail and didn't actually get let go. I don't remember how. sorry, not sorry. But it's the day of Eve and Charles's wedding, and she's like packing a bag to escape. She knows one of the dissidents has helped Caleb get out of jail, and she's on her way back to the hangar, and she sees that things like don't look right and nobody's there, and Soldier Stark appears. You haven't seen the last of him. No. He is back. He found out about the tunnel. He's captured Joe and Curtis. I just remembered the two other rebels' names that we are working with. Joe and Curtis. Joe's the woman, Curtis is the man, whatever. Eve gets grabbed, and she hears like footsteps coming towards her, and she assumes it's Caleb, and she's like, Caleb, run! And she sees him around the corner and gets shot and go down, and a bunch of soldiers get on top of him. Eve is thrown back into the palace, where she sees the head of press. His name is Reginald, and he's like, I need a moment alone with the princess to get her thoughts on the wedding or whatever, and the soldiers are like, fine. Eve's hysterical, like, Caleb is dead. And Reginald is like, or she's like, Reginald, I don't have time for you, like, I need to go. And he's like, I'm not Reginald, I'm Moss. Wow, wow, wow. He is Moss. Remember when Caleb was like, the newspaper has more than just you in it, or whatever he said? He was talking about Moss, the writer of the newspaper, the head of press, Reginald Moss. They're the same person. And Moss is like, Caleb is dead. The new mission is for you to kill the king. So you need to get your butt in there and go marry Prince Charles. And Eve is like, what? And she gets married to Charles. The book ends with their like processional or whatever when she's walking down the aisle. And she's like, I can't believe Caleb's dead. And that's how book 2 ends. Honestly, such a good cliffhanger. Like, way to just like kill the love interest. Like, way to kill like Eve's purpose for living. Like, honestly, kind of a slay, Anna Carey. Snaps. Snaps to you. Book 3, Rise, published in 2013. The final book in this wonderful, magical, beautiful trilogy opens with basically right after the wedding. They're at like a Christmas celebration, whatever. And there's lots of talks about the rebellion, because something called the Outlands, which is basically like the outer circle of the city of Sand, where all the poor people, all the laborers work and live, are kind of like not happy. And there's talks of them revolting against the king. And there's also like this whole thing that's like, they were promised subsidized housing and like income opportunities, and the king hasn't delivered, and instead he's investing in the colonies outside of the city of Sand that he's trying to maintain control over. So now we learned about the Outlands, the colonies, and there's also the labor camps and the capitalized schools outside of the city of Sand. So no one's really paying attention to Eve, and she kind of dips and goes to bed early, and the next morning she hears like tons of jeeps, and her and Charles are sharing a suite now, but he sleeps on the couch. She's like, don't touch me. I love somebody else, I don't love you. Even though he's kind of trying to make it work, you know? Like, he was a little bit forced into this too, but I guess we'll disregard him. But she sees all these jeeps, and Charles admits that he knows that the girls from the schools are being brought into the city of Sand because the labor camps are revolting and rising up. And people and the regime in the city are nervous that the schools are going to be affected and the girls are going to escape as well. So they're bringing the girls in to have like a closer eye on them. Eva, of course, is like hysterical. She runs out to the school and she is hunting around for Pip, Ruby, and Arden, her girlies, and she doesn't see them, but she sees somebody else from her class, and that girl's like, they escaped 3 weeks ago. And Eva's like, for you, they got out of here. But also now there's a new worry of like, are they going to survive the wilderness? She also sees Beatrice, who is reunited with her daughter Sarah. Her daughter Sarah was in the schools. She like sent her there because she couldn't afford to take care of her or something like that. Also, oh my god, this was so important, I totally forgot to say it, Beatrice was the one who betrayed Eve. That's how Soldier Stark found the hangar and the airplane where they were going to escape the tunnel, where one of the 3 tunnels is now down. So Eve and Beatrice kind of had a tiff, but they're like girly pops again now. Moss gives Eve like this bag with a knife and the poison, and he's like, the original poison we wanted wasn't available, so we have this weaker poison, so you need to give more to the king. And she's like, okay, work. Then Eve, like, I don't know, it's like dinner or I don't know, something where other people are around, and she like very suddenly gets really sick. And she like throws up a bunch and then like goes to sleep. And while she's sleeping, Claire is like watching over her, making sure she's okay. And doctors are like running all these tests. And Eve wakes up. She's like, it's really not a big deal. I just like had a moment. Eve is pregnant. Yes, friends. Yes, there is a pregnancy freaking trope in this book. And it's real. It's not like the Hunger Games where it's fake. It's real. She's really pregnant. She had sex with Caleb once. And she's pregnant. Obviously, Claire is hysterical. And Eve confirms that it's not Charles, it's Caleb's. And the king is so excited because he's like, yes, everything according to plan. She pretends to get sick while like hanging out with the king in his suite and goes in his bathroom to like pretend to throw up. And that's when she literally, and somehow she does it like without any issues. She opens his like cholesterol pills or whatever and empties the dust and puts poison in it, in like 6 or 7 of the pills. I can't even get those pills open, but like, okay, work. So yeah, she successfully poisoned him. But on her way out of the bathroom, the king grabs her and is like, we have to go tell Charles good news. And she's like, oh no, I don't think so. She like has the poison still on her and like a knife and stuff. She's like planning to escape. But the king drags her out to go to Charles, to the site that he's working. And she's like, it's kind of funny. It's not funny actually. But because she's having such bad morning sickness, she's like really nauseous the whole car ride. It's just a random detail that I remember laughing at. But she gets there and she's like panicking. She's like, Charles knows it's not his because we have not had sex. And he's going to give me up to the king. And I'm done for. The king's going to kill me. She gets there and the king's like, Eve, tell him the good news. And he's like, I'm pregnant. And Charles like takes a second and then he hugs her and he's like, I'm so happy. He like goes with it. And Eve's like, yeah, maybe Charles is actually a good guy. The next morning, it's breakfast. Everybody's at breakfast. Clara, Rose, Charles, Eve, but not the king. And everyone kind of knows the king is sick. He obviously ingests the poison. He's getting sick. And Eve knows that Moss said that the revolution is going to start tomorrow. She goes to find Moss because she's like, the king is dying. I suddenly have empathy for Rose and Clara and Charles, and I don't think they should die. So she goes find Moss to convince him to let them escape. And Clara grabs her and is like, let's go to lunch. So they go to lunch, and Clara's like trying to get information out of Eve, and Eve's not really spilling. And then suddenly there's a loud boom. Skadoosh. And soldiers start blocking the door to the restaurant. Everyone in the restaurant's like pushing out, and Clara and Eve get out. They get back to the palace, and Eve is like, I need to see Reginald. And Charles is like, I haven't seen him since this morning. Eve is now listening to the radio because Moss is putting messages out that way, or the trailers or whatever. And she found out that the colonies actually backed out of the revolution, and it's just the Outlands and like the labor camp people now. Again, next morning, it's breakfast. There's like constant gunshots, so everybody's very like anxious this whole breakfast, right? And Eve excuses herself and she's like, I need to escape right now. I need to escape right now. On her way, she gets grabbed by a doctor, and the doctor's like, the king wants to see you. And she's like, I don't feel well, I'm going to my room. And he's like, I don't care. You're coming with me to see the king. And who's there but Moss / Reginald, tied up with his hands behind his back. Eve is now restrained as well. And the king is like, I know about the dissidents. I know about the revolution. I know he's Moss, and I know you're involved. Admit it. And Eve's like, no. And then she attacks the soldier. She like slams her head into the guy holding her. Moss escapes too. They're getting the heckity heck out of there. And the king is like, just because you're pregnant doesn't mean you're immune. And she's like, immune to what? You killing me? And on their way to the elevator, the soldiers shoot Moss, and he dies in the elevator on their way down. Eve gets out, and she sees Joe and Curtis, those two friends from the revolution, getting hung. Soldiers are like hanging dissidents now, which is crazy. So they're dead now too. Eve sees the school as well on her way out of the palace, and she turns around and Clara's behind her, and Clara's like, I'm coming with you. And Eve's like, absolutely not, you're staying here. And Clara's like, well, I'm following you whether you want me to or not, so like enlist my help. And Eve's like, okay, help me get these girls out. So Beatrice is still in the school. I guess she's no longer Eve's maid. And they get Beatrice's daughter Sarah and a bunch of the other girls out of the school, and they get to the location where Moss had told Eve to use to escape. Remember back when he like gave her a knife and the poison and stuff? Damn, can you see I'm deflating? I'm like, oh, these books. They got me in a tizzy. They're taking up too much of my time. Anyway, they make it to the location, but they're being pursued by soldiers. Eve and Clara got slowed down by grabbing Beatrice and the girls from the school. But they escape through the hole in the ground for the third tunnel, but the soldiers do spot it, so now that's 2 tunnels down. And the girls kind of have to swim. It's like full of water. So there's like a moment where Eve's like, I didn't know how to swim and Caleb taught me, so now I'm teaching these girls how to swim so we can all escape together. Yes. So they escape, and now they're out in the wilderness. There's like a whole thing where I'm like not even gonna get into it. Like there's drama with the girls. One of the girls breaks her leg, and then they have to like drag her on a sled. They go to Marjorie and Otis's house. One of the girls uses a radio to try to call the city of Sand or whatever to come help them, because the girls are struggling to like believe Eve or accept their fate out in the wilderness. Eve kills a guy who responds to the radio and like tries to grab her. I don't know, it's really dramatic, but essentially Eve decides that they're not going to make it to Califia with the girl with the broken leg, and they need to stop at the dugout. From book 1, ladies and gentlemen, we're going back to the dugout, yes, because it's like on the way. It's at Lake Tahoe, actually, and I don't know where Califia is. It sounds like California, so maybe it's like the capital of California? I don't know. It's not clear. They make it to the dugout, and Eve goes in first because she like knows the people there and is hoping to see them. And she sees Benny and Silas, and guess who else? Ruby and Pip. Yes, Ruby and Pip. They're both very pregnant. They're rotund. And they're like, everybody left to go help the rebellion, including Arden. Especially Arden and Leaf, who are going to the colonies to try to convince them to join the rebellion. Because, like, we can't do it without them. And then Benny and Silas, the little boys, are there too. Because they're too young to fight. And Ruby and Pip are, like, kind of taking care of them. Pip, like, has a big fight with Eve because she's mad that Eve chose Arden over Pip. And Eve's like, I didn't, that was coincidence. And Pip's like, fine. So they like make up. There's like lots of conversations. Like it's kind of like a very emotional part of the book with Eve and Ruby and Pip reunited, and the girls are like meeting boys for the first time, whatever. The girl with the broken leg gets fixed up. And Eve decides to actually stay at the dugout with Ruby and Pip until they give birth, because while Ruby is doing well with pregnancy, Pip is very sick. She's like, I can't leave. Like, I can't go to Califia, even though from what you say, it's the best place for me. I can't move. So Eve gives Clara and Beatrice directions on how to get to Califia to kind of finish the journey. And then within the same couple of days, while Eve is teaching everybody to swim, Pip dies in the lake, Lake Tahoe. Like, she bleeds out and she dies. And now, without Pip kind of holding them back, Eve, Ruby, Benny, Silas, Clara, Beatrice, her daughter Sarah, and all the girls from the school now steal the horses from the dugout, and they are going to go to Califia. They make it in a record time with the horse, which is crazy because it took a whole book to get there in book 1, but like work. They get there, and obviously the women there are like, Benny and Silas can't come, they're boys. And Eve's like, they're literally children. Let them in. And so easily are they swayed. They're like, yeah, okay, we'll reassess when they turn 18. Like, a way to betray your one rule that you have upheld in like 2 seconds. Right, Maeve? We remember from Founding Mother in book 2. It's because everyone's back in Cleveland now, right? But Eve confronts Maeve. Maeve admits, yeah, I would have sacrificed you to save the masses. You don't think that's the right thing to do? And Eve's kind of like, I have to think on that one. And then Maeve tells Eve that there's been a lot of radio transmissions about how the king is going to live and how the rebellion's struggling because the king's alive and giving orders to the regime and the soldiers. Eve's like, I have to go back. And Maeve is like, I have a motorcycle in the garage. And somehow Eve just knows how to ride the motorcycle. And in 3 days, she makes it back to the city of sand. She leaves everybody behind in Califia, safe and sound, and she goes back. In 3 days. Work. She gets into the palace using that tunnel they used to escape, even though the soldiers found it and, like, you know, assumably took it over that tunnel. Eve uses the same one and gets into the city. Work. She gets into the palace from stealing clothes off a dead soldier on the street. Work. Charles is the first to see her and recognize her, and he's like, this is the code, they changed it, I can't believe you're here, like, are we really gonna die? And Eve's like, I got work to do. She, like, dips. She goes to her father's study and knocks on the door, and he opens it and sees her, and he's like, ha ha ha, you've returned, you won't kill me, you're my daughter. And he slips something up his sleeve, and she catches it, and she freaking shoots him. She shoots him, and he dies. He goes down, and he dies, and she sees, like, a gun slip out of his sleeve. He was going to kill her. Like, this man is a bad man. And then soldiers, obviously hearing the gunshots, start storming into the office, and they're like, the king's down, the king's down. And the lieutenant, another person, another important part that is never given a name. He is the capital T lieutenant, capital L. The lieutenant grabs Eve and he's like, he turns to the soldiers and he says, nobody tell the people that the king is dead. He's just hurt and he has elected me to take his place. So Mr. Lieutenant Man is trying to take over the joint. And he drags Eve out to the hanging tree, like literally like from the Hunger Games, to kill her, to execute her. Obviously Charles is like, no. And Rose is also there, Queen Rose, Clara's mom and the king's sister, is like, what are you doing? Where's Clara? And Eve's like, Clara's alive. And she's about to be hung when a explosion happens like right outside the palace for the first time. And all the people watching and the soldiers, like, run away. The lieutenant still tries to kill her, but she, like, escapes. And she gets to this warehouse and hides in there. Rebels break into that warehouse and are, like, looking for people who are part of the regime. And they recognize Eve, obviously, because she's the freaking princess. And they drag her to the rebel location to be executed. And who does she see? Who does she see there? Arden. Arden is one of the 3 heads of the rebellion at this time. She was the one, or one of the many, or one of the few, I don't know, who convinced the colonies to help with the revolution. And she sees Eve and they embrace because they're sisters. 3 weeks pass. 3 weeks pass. We're now in the future. The rebels won. Yes. Not really thanks to Eve. She didn't really do much, but that's okay. We love a simple sister. Trucks are bringing in the schoolgirls and the boys from the labor camps. The hurt are being taken care of. There's like a presidential election coming up, and Arden might be running because she's a queen bee. And Eve goes to one of the hospitals and she asks the doctor, do you have any patients from the Lake Tahoe dugout? Hoping to like find Leaf or one of the other boys she knew who decided to go fight. He's like, only one, but the king asked me to kill him and I didn't. So I don't know. He just was able to sit up, and she was like, what's his name? And the doctor's like, Caleb Young. Yes. We find out in the second to last page of the 3rd book in the series that Mr. Caleb not only is alive, but also has a last name. He is the only character with the last name, Caleb Young. And of course she's like blinded by joy and she runs to the room that the doctor mentioned. The doctor shouts, who are you? And she turns back and goes, I'm his wife. And that is how the trilogy ends. I know. They really said you thought we were going to kill the love of her life? You thought? Think again. We do get a cute little epilogue. Apparently there was like tea with this series because there was no epilogue originally, so the people never got to see Caleb and Eve reunite, and there was like uproar over that. So later, like publishing copies of Rise, the third book in the series, had an epilogue in it, but the epilogue's kind of like not probably what you want. It's like 4 or 5 years in the future. Eve has her daughter, who she names Pippa. Like Peppa Pig, but Pip for her friend who died. Pippa. Work. Essentially, all that happens in the epilogue, I'm not going to super get into it, but they have to leave the city of sand because the president, who has been president for the past 4 years, the first elected president since the virus, did not get elected for re-election even though he was amazing, and somebody who worked for the king under the regime did, and Eve feels like it's a danger for her to stay. She's also a history teacher, which is crazy because book 1 she was like, I want to be a painter, and then book 2 she was like, I teach writing and I work at the bookstore in Clevia, and now book 3 she's a history teacher. She's multifaceted. She's a multifaceted girl. Jack of all trades. But they are leaving the city of sand to go to Clefia, which now is open to men. It's just like another location to live, because why would they need to protect women when the schools no longer exist, the labor camps no longer exist, and the city of sand is under the regime. But they're going to Clefia, which Pippa is really excited about because she can go see her besties, Benny and Silas. Yes, they stayed in Clefia. And how the epilogue ends is to calm Pippa down because she's like upset about leaving the city of sand. Eve is like drawing pictures on her back, and she draws something, and Pippa's like, you drew the sun, Mommy. Mommy drew the sun. And that's how it ends. I hope you enjoyed this plot recap of the Eve trilogy by Anna Carey, published 2011 to 2013. I had a great time reading these books. It's very nostalgic and also very eye-opening to truly how our taste in literature changes as we age, as our interests change, etc., etc. Because I definitely thought this was like a masterpiece when I was a kid. I was like, of course women would be used to be bred to repopulate a nation after the plague. And the pretty girl who's the daughter of the king who mysteriously disappeared and came back is going to save the world, even though Eve like didn't. All she did was kill the king, which like anybody could have done. But again, I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do whatever you want to do. I'm not your mother. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you want me to do another one, I do have another trilogy in mind. Another really lackluster YA romance series, but it is fantasy instead of dystopian. So let me know. Have a good one. Bye.